Imagine a man sold as property, branded like cattle, and trained to kill for the entertainment of others. He had no army, no weapons, and no hope of freedom. And yet he would bring the mightiest empire on earth to its knees. This is Spartacus, the gladiator who dared to challenge Rome itself. But before we drift off into this story, leave a like and comment where you are watching from, so others can find their way here too. Now, let us journey back to the blood-soaked arenas of ancient Rome to discover the slave who almost changed history forever. The story of Spartacus does not begin in the gladiator schools of Italy. It begins far to the north, in the wild and rugged lands of Thrace. This was a region that lay between the great civilizations of Greece and the mysterious tribes of the northern steppes. It is roughly the land we now call Bulgaria and parts of Greece and Turkey. The Thracians were not a single unified nation. They were a collection of fierce warrior tribes who lived in the mountains and valleys of this beautiful but harsh land. They were known throughout the ancient world as some of the most fearsome fighters alive. Greek historians wrote of them with a mixture of respect and fear. They describe men who were tall and strong, with tattoos covering their skin, and a love of battle that bordered on madness. To be born a Thracian was to be born into a world of constant warfare, raiding, and struggle for survival. Spartacus was born into this world sometime around 111 BC. We do not know the exact date or the exact place. The historical records of a slave's early life were simply not kept by the Romans. What we do know comes from fragments, hints dropped by later historians, who were more interested in the war he would eventually fight. Some ancient sources suggest he came from the Midi tribe, a particularly fierce group that lived near the Strymon River. His childhood would have been one of hardship and training. Thracian boys learned to fight almost as soon as they could walk. They were taught to ride horses, to throw javelins, and to survive in the wilderness. The weak did not survive in Thrace. Only the strong lived long enough to become warriors. How Spartacus came to be a slave in Rome is a matter of historical mystery. The most likely story is that he was once a soldier. Some ancient writers suggest he even served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army itself. Rome often recruited warriors from the tribes on its borders. These auxiliaries were not Roman citizens, but they fought alongside the legions in exchange for pay and the promise of eventual citizenship. If this is true, it would mean that Spartacus learned the Roman way of war from the inside. He would have seen how the legions marched, how they made camp, how they fought in their disciplined formations. This knowledge would prove invaluable later in his life. At some point, something went terribly wrong for the young Thracian. Perhaps he deserted the army. Perhaps he was captured in a border skirmish. Perhaps he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever the reason, Spartacus found himself stripped of his freedom and sold into slavery. This was a fate that befell millions in the ancient world. Slavery was not based on race or colour, it was based on misfortune. Anyone could become a slave through war, debt, or simple bad luck. For a proud Thracian warrior, a man raised to value freedom and honour above all else, the shame of being reduced to property must have been unbearable. The slave markets of the Roman world were brutal and efficient places. Human beings were displayed like livestock. They were examined, prodded and valued based on their physical condition. A strong, healthy man, in the prime of his life, would fetch a high price. A trained warrior, even higher. Spartacus, with his powerful build and his fierce Thracian bearing, caught the attention of a particular type of buyer. He was purchased not for labour in the fields or service in a wealthy household. He was purchased to fight and die for the amusement of Roman crowds. He was destined for the gladiator schools. The man who bought Spartacus was named Lentulus Batiatus. He was a lanista, an owner and trainer of gladiators. His gladiator school, or ludus, was located in the city of Capua, south of Rome. Capua was famous throughout Italy for its gladiator schools. It was a centre for the brutal industry of training men to kill each other in the arena. For Batiatus, gladiators were an investment. He fed them, housed them, trained them, and then rented them out to the wealthy sponsors of games across Italy. A successful gladiator could make his owner very rich. A dead gladiator was simply a loss to be written off. Life inside the ludus of Batiatus was a strange mixture of privilege and horror. The gladiators lived in a kind of barracks. They slept in small cells, but they were fed well. Gladiators needed to be strong and healthy to put on a good show. They received medical care when injured. They were given high-protein diets of barley and beans. In some ways, they were treated better than many free peasants in the Roman world, but this relative comfort came at a terrible price. They were prisoners, they were property, and they knew that their ultimate purpose was to bleed and possibly die for the entertainment of screaming crowds. The training was intense and unrelenting. Gladiators were taught by experienced fighters called doctores. They learned to fight with a variety of weapons. There were different types of gladiators, each with their own armour and fighting style. Some fought with swords and shields. Others used tridents and nets. Some were heavily armoured, others nearly naked. Spartacus, being a Thracian, was likely trained in the Thracian style. This meant he would have fought with a curved short sword called a sica and a small round shield. His helmet would have had a distinctive griffin crest. The training taught these men how to fight, how to wound, and how to kill, in ways that were entertaining to watch. It was a school of death. The psychological toll of this life was immense. Every day, Spartacus and his fellow gladiators trained alongside men they might be ordered to kill tomorrow. They formed friendships, knowing those friends could become their opponents in the arena. The constant presence of death, the loss of all freedom and dignity, the knowledge that their bodies belonged to another man. These things created a simmering rage within the walls of the ludus. The gladiators were kept under strict control. They were watched at all times. Their weapons were locked away after training. The owners knew they were sitting on a powder keg. They knew that these men, trained in the arts of war, were dangerous. They just did not know how dangerous. The conditions in Batiatus's school seem to have been particularly harsh. Ancient sources mention that the gladiators were treated with great cruelty. They were perhaps worked harder than others, punished more severely, or simply held in more degrading conditions. Whatever the specific reasons, the men in this ludus reached a breaking point. They began to whisper among themselves. They began to plot. The dream of freedom, the one thing that slavery could never fully extinguish, began to burn brighter in their hearts. They were warriors. They were trained killers. And they decided they would rather die fighting for their freedom than live another day in chains. In the year 73 BC, the whispers turned into a plan. Spartacus was at the centre of this conspiracy, along with two other gladiators named Crixus and Oenomaus. These three men became the leaders of what would become the largest and most dangerous slave uprising in Roman history. Their plan was simple and desperate. They would break out of the ludus, seize whatever weapons they could find, and fight their way to freedom. About 200 gladiators were part of the plot. They chose a moment and prepared to act. They were gambling everything on one chance, but the plot was betrayed. Somehow, word of the conspiracy reached the ears of the lanista. Perhaps a nervous conspirator talked. Perhaps a spy overheard something. The details are lost to history. What we know is that Batiatus became aware that something was wrong. He took steps to increase security. The moment of opportunity was slipping away. When the gladiators realized their plan had been discovered, they knew they had to act immediately or face terrible punishment. The penalty for plotting an escape was death, but not a quick death. A slow, agonizing death by crucifixion, or worse. In a desperate and chaotic moment, about 70 or 80 of the gladiators made their move. They could not get to the armory where their training weapons were kept. The locks were too strong and the guards too many. But they found another way. They broke into the kitchens of the ludus. There they seized the tools of the cooks. They armed themselves with kitchen knives, cleavers, meat hooks, and iron spits used for roasting meat. These were crude weapons, nothing like the swords and shields they had trained with. But in the hands of desperate men trained to kill, even a kitchen knife was deadly. With these improvised weapons, the gladiators fought their way out of the ludus. They battled through the guards who tried to stop them. They smashed through the gates and burst out into the streets of Capua. The city must have been thrown into chaos. The sight of dozens of blood-covered gladiators running through the streets, armed and screaming for freedom, would have sent the citizens fleeing in terror. The gladiators did not stop to loot or to burn. They knew they had to get out of the city as fast as possible. They ran for the countryside, for the one place where they might have a chance to survive. The great looming shadow of Mount Vesuvius. As they fled through the countryside, the escaped gladiators had an incredible stroke of luck. They came across a convoy of wagons on the road. These wagons were carrying a shipment of gladiator equipment to another ludus, or perhaps to an arena for upcoming games. The weapons and armour were right there, stacked in the carts, ready for the taking. The gladiators ambushed the convoy and seized everything. Now they were no longer armed with kitchen knives. Now they had the swords, shields, and armour they had been trained to use. They had transformed from a desperate band of escapees into something far more dangerous. They were now a small but well-armed fighting force. The escapees made their way to Mount Vesuvius. This was a bold choice. Vesuvius was a dormant volcano that loomed over the Bay of Naples. Its slopes were wild and rugged, covered in thick vegetation. At the summit was a large crater, and the paths leading up were narrow and treacherous. It was the perfect place for a small band to hide and defend themselves. The gladiators climbed the mountain and made camp in the crater at the top. From here, they could see anyone approaching from miles away. The narrow paths meant that any attacking force would have to come at them in single file. It was a natural fortress. Word of the escape spread quickly. At first, the Roman authorities were not particularly alarmed. Slave rebellions and escapes were not uncommon in Italy. Rome was a society built on slavery, and there was always friction. The local authorities in Capua sent a small militia force to deal with the problem. They assumed it would be a simple matter of surrounding the mountain and starving the gladiators out, or simply climbing up and killing them. They vastly underestimated what they were facing. They saw escaped slaves. They did not see an army in the making. The gladiators on Vesuvius were not content to simply hide. Spartacus and his fellow leaders were thinking bigger. They sent out raiding parties into the surrounding countryside. They attacked farms and villas. They freed slaves wherever they went and invited them to join the rebellion. The message spread like wildfire through the slave population of the region. There were men on Vesuvius who were fighting for freedom. Any slave who could escape their master and make their way to the mountain would be welcomed. The numbers on Vesuvius began to grow. What had started as 70 or 80 gladiators was becoming something much larger. The Roman response was slow and complacent. A praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber was sent south with a force of about 3,000 militia soldiers. These were not hardened legionaries. They were local troops, hastily assembled and poorly trained. Glaber's plan was simple and unimaginative. He marched his men to the base of Mount Vesuvius and set up a siege. He blocked the main path leading up the mountain. His plan was to simply wait. The slaves would eventually run out of food and water. They would be forced to surrender or starve. He settled in for a comfortable siege, confident that the problem would solve itself. Spartacus had other ideas. The Thracian leader studied the mountain carefully. He noticed that while the Romans had blocked the main path, they had not bothered to guard the other sides of the crater. The slopes there were covered in thick wild grapevines. The Romans assumed these cliffs were impassable. No one could climb down those sheer rock faces covered in tangled vegetation. Spartacus saw an opportunity where others saw an obstacle. He ordered his men to cut the thick grapevines. They wove them into rough but strong ladders and ropes. Under the cover of darkness, the gladiators climbed down the unguarded side of the mountain. The Roman camp at the base of the mountain was completely unaware. Glaber's men were sleeping, confident that their quarry was trapped above them. Then, in the middle of the night, screams erupted. Spartacus and his gladiators struck the Roman camp from behind. They appeared out of nowhere, charging into the disorganized mass of sleeping soldiers. The Roman militia was thrown into complete chaos. They had no time to form ranks, no time to organize a defense. They were slaughtered where they slept, or fled into the darkness in terror. The Roman siege of Vesuvius ended in a total and humiliating defeat. This victory was transformative. The gladiators had defeated a Roman military force. They had captured weapons, armour, supplies, and most importantly, they had captured Roman military equipment. Spartacus now began to arm and train his growing army in the Roman style of warfare. The escaped slaves who flooded to his banner were formed into units. They were drilled in Roman tactics. Spartacus was using his knowledge of the Roman military, gained perhaps from his time as an auxiliary, to turn a ragged band of rebels into something that could stand against the legions. Rome sent another force, this time under a praetor named Publius Varinius. He brought more troops, but his confidence was no greater. The Romans still saw this as a police action against rebellious slaves, not a real war. Varinius made a series of blunders. He divided his forces, sending them out in smaller groups that Spartacus was able to defeat, in detail one by one. In one particularly embarrassing incident, Spartacus ambushed Varinius so quickly that the Roman commander barely escaped with his life. He had to abandon his own horse and his official symbols of office. The rebels captured the lictors, who carried the fasces, the ceremonial bundles of rods that symbolized Roman authority. For a Roman commander to lose his fasces was a profound humiliation. The slave army had captured the very symbols of Roman power. With each victory, the rebellion grew. News of Spartacus and his successes spread across the Italian peninsula. Slaves from farms, mines, and households everywhere began to escape and make their way to join the rebel army. At its peak, ancient sources suggest that the army of Spartacus numbered somewhere between 70,000 and 120,000 men. Even the lower estimate was an enormous force. This was no longer a slave revolt. This was an army, one of the largest ever assembled in Italy, and it was led by a man the Romans had dismissed as mere property. As the army grew, challenges emerged. Not all of the rebel leaders agreed on what to do next. Spartacus reportedly wanted to march north. His plan was to cross the Alps and escape from Italy entirely. Once across the mountains, the slaves could disperse to their homelands. The Thracians could return to Thrace, the Gauls to Gaul, the Germans to their northern forests. They would be free and beyond the reach of Roman vengeance. Spartacus understood Rome. He knew that the Republic would never stop hunting them as long as they remained in Italy. Escape was the only path to lasting freedom. But other leaders, particularly a Gaul named Crixus, had different ideas. Crixus and many of the Gallic and Germanic slaves did not want to run. They wanted to fight. They wanted revenge on the Romans who had enslaved them. They wanted to plunder the rich villas and cities of Italy. The idea of simply walking away after finally having power in their hands was unthinkable to them. This disagreement created a serious split in the rebel army. The forces that had been so effective when united began to fracture along ethnic and ideological lines. In the spring of 72 BC, the split became final. Crixus led a large contingent of Gallic and Germanic fighters away from the main army. He wanted to stay in southern Italy and continue raiding and fighting. Spartacus continued his march north with the bulk of the forces. The separation was a strategic disaster for the rebellion. Divided, they were far more vulnerable. Rome was finally beginning to take the threat seriously. The Senate appointed 2 consuls, the highest elected officials in the Republic, to deal with the crisis. Each consul commanded 2 legions. A total of 4 legions, perhaps 40,000 trained Roman soldiers, were now mobilized to crush the slave revolt once and for all. The army of Crixus was the first to feel the full weight of Roman military power. A force under the command of a consul, named Lucius Gellius Publicola, caught up with the Gauls near Mount Garganus in Apulia. The battle was fierce, but the outcome was decisive. The Roman legions, properly organised and led, smashed through the rebel forces. Crixus himself was killed in the fighting. His army was destroyed. Thousands of slaves were killed on the battlefield or captured to face punishment. The rebellion had suffered its first major defeat, and it lost one of its original leaders. When news of Crixus's death reached Spartacus, he reportedly held funeral games in his honour. But these were not ordinary funeral games. In a grim reversal of fate, Spartacus forced captured Roman soldiers to fight each other as gladiators. The men who had once watched slaves kill each other for entertainment were now made to do the same for the amusement of the former slaves. It was a brutal and symbolic act of revenge. It showed that Spartacus had not forgotten his years in the arena. It showed that the cruelty of Roman society could be turned back upon itself. Despite this gesture of defiance, Spartacus continued his march north. His strategy remained the same. He needed to get his people out of Italy. Through the spring and summer of 72 BC, the slave army marched up the Italian peninsula. They defeated another consular army sent against them. They pushed through one obstacle after another. Finally, they reached Cisalpine Gaul, the northern region of Italy just south of the Alps. The mountains were right there. Freedom was within sight. The slaves had only to cross the high passes, and they would be beyond Roman reach forever. And then, inexplicably, they turned around. This is one of the great mysteries of the Spartacus revolt. Why, after marching all the way to the Alps, did the army turn south again? Ancient historians offer different explanations. Some say the slaves were afraid of the cold and the dangers of the mountain passes. Some say they were drunk on their victories and wanted more plunder from Italy. Some say that the rank and file simply refused to leave, overruling Spartacus's plan. Whatever the reason, the decision was catastrophic. By turning south, the rebels were marching back into the heart of Roman power. They were giving Rome time to organize a response. They were choosing a war they could not ultimately win. Rome was now truly frightened. The Senate took an extraordinary step. They appointed a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus to command the war against Spartacus. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome. He had made his fortune through real estate, mining, and what some called the ancient equivalent of a fire department, though his methods were notoriously ruthless. He was ambitious, intelligent, and utterly determined to crush the rebellion and claim the glory for himself. He was given command of 8 legions, the largest Roman army assembled in Italy since the wars against Hannibal. Crassus was a different kind of commander than those Spartacus had faced before. He was ruthless in enforcing discipline. When some of his troops broke and ran from a skirmish with the rebels, he revived an ancient and terrible punishment called decimation. The fleeing soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and the one who drew the short straw was beaten to death by the other 9. It was a brutal message. Crassus was telling his soldiers that they should fear him more than they feared Spartacus. Death in battle was preferable to the disgrace of cowardice. The slave army had marched south, all the way to the toe of the Italian boot. Spartacus now conceived a bold new plan. He would cross the narrow strait to the island of Sicily. Sicily was a place of enormous slave populations, working the vast agricultural estates that fed Rome. If Spartacus could land his army there, he could raise a new and even larger rebellion. Sicily had a history of slave revolts. The island could become a base from which the war against Rome could be continued indefinitely. To cross the straits, Spartacus needed ships. He made a deal with Cilician pirates, notorious sea raiders from the coast of what is now Turkey. The pirates agreed to provide the ships in exchange for a large payment. Spartacus gathered his army on the coast, ready to cross. And then the pirates betrayed him. They took his money and sailed away, leaving the slave army stranded on the Italian mainland with no escape. The reasons for the betrayal are unknown. Perhaps Rome paid them more. Perhaps they simply saw a more profitable opportunity elsewhere. The result was that Spartacus was now trapped. Crassus saw his opportunity. He marched his legions to the narrow neck of land that connected the toe of Italy to the rest of the peninsula. There he ordered his soldiers to begin a massive engineering project. They dug a great trench across the entire peninsula, from sea to sea. This trench was reportedly 37 miles long, 15 feet wide, and 15 feet deep. Behind the trench they built a wall of earth and timber. Crassus was building a wall to trap Spartacus in the southernmost tip of Italy. He would starve the rebels out or force them to attack his fortified position. It was a siege on a massive scale. The slave army was now desperate. Winter was coming. Food was running low. The only way out was through the Roman lines. Spartacus launched a night attack against the wall. In a furious assault, the rebels broke through a section of the fortifications. About a third of the army managed to escape through the gap before the Romans could seal it. But the breakout was costly. Many slaves were killed in the fighting, and the army was now weakened and scattered. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Spartacus tried to hold his forces together, but the pressures were becoming unbearable. Another group of rebels, impatient and desperate, broke away from the main army. They were caught by Crassus's legions and massacred. 12,300 slaves reportedly died in this engagement. Each defeat cost irreplaceable men. Each loss of discipline weakened the army further. The momentum of the rebellion was slipping away. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate had grown impatient with Crassus. They feared the war was dragging on too long. They recalled 2 of Rome's most famous generals from their foreign campaigns to help finish the job. Pompey the Great was summoned from Spain, where he had been fighting a long war. Lucullus was recalled from the east. The message to Crassus was clear. Finish this now, or others will take the glory from you. Crassus was determined to end the war before his rivals arrived. The final battle came in the spring of 71 BC. The exact location is debated by historians, but it was somewhere in the southern Italian region of Lucania, near the headwaters of the Sila River. Spartacus knew that this was likely his last stand. Crassus had superior numbers and trained legions. Pompey's army was marching from the north and would arrive soon. There was no escape this time, no clever trick, no mountain to hide on. The only choice was to fight. Before the battle, Spartacus reportedly performed a final dramatic act. He brought out his horse, a fine animal that had served him well through the long campaign. In front of his assembled army, he drew his sword and killed the horse. He told his men that if they won the battle, he would have plenty of fine Roman horses to choose from, and if they lost, he would have no need of a horse at all. It was a gesture of total commitment. There would be no retreat, no surrender, victory or death. The armies clashed in a brutal and desperate battle. The slaves fought with the fury of men who knew their lives depended on the outcome. But the Roman legions held their lines. They did not break. The discipline that Crassus had beaten into them with the threat of decimation now paid its dividend. Hour after hour, the fighting raged. The slave army was slowly pushed back, slowly ground down by the relentless Roman machine. During the battle, Spartacus tried to force a decision through single combat. He fought his way toward Crassus himself, hoping to kill the Roman commander and throw the legions into confusion. It was the kind of heroic gamble that a Thracian warrior would understand. He cut down 2 centurions who tried to block his path. He was wounded in the leg but kept fighting, but he could not reach Crassus. The Roman bodyguards were too many, and eventually the press of battle separated them. The chance was lost. The battle ended in total defeat for the slave army. The rebellion that had shaken Rome to its foundations was crushed on the fields of Lucania. Thousands of slaves were killed in the fighting. Thousands more were captured. Spartacus himself fell in battle. His body was never identified. In the chaos and carnage of the battlefield, among the thousands of dead, the body of the gladiator who had defied Rome simply disappeared. There was no tomb for Spartacus, no marker, no final resting place. He vanished into history as mysteriously as he had emerged from it. The Roman vengeance was terrible. Crassus wanted to send a message that would echo through the ages, a warning to any slave who might dream of rebellion. He ordered that 6,000 captured slaves be crucified. Their crosses were erected along the Appian Way, the great road that led from Capua to Rome. For mile after mile, travellers on the road would pass the dying and the dead, nailed to wooden crosses, left to rot, as a grim reminder of Roman power. The bodies were never taken down. They were left for the birds and the weather. The Appian Way became a road of horrors, a testament to what happened to those who challenged the might of Rome. Crassus did not get the triumphal parade he wanted. Pompey had arrived just in time to intercept and destroy a band of 5,000 fugitives who had escaped the final battle. He then claimed, with characteristic arrogance, that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he, Pompey, had pulled up the war by its roots. The glory was divided and diminished. Crassus received the lesser honour of an ovation, not a full triumph. He would spend the rest of his political career trying to match the military fame of Pompey, a rivalry that would eventually lead him to his death in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians. But the story of Spartacus did not end with his death. The rebellion changed Rome in ways that outlasted all its participants. The fear of another slave uprising haunted the Roman elite for generations. Security measures were tightened. Gladiator schools were placed under closer supervision. The treatment of slaves, while still brutal by any modern standard, was in some ways softened by the memory of what had happened when desperation pushed men too far. The ghost of Spartacus lingered in the Roman conscience. More importantly, the legend of Spartacus grew. In the centuries after his death, he became a symbol. For the Romans, he was a cautionary tale of the dangers of slavery and the courage of desperate men. For later generations, he became something more. He became an icon of resistance against oppression. His story was retold and reshaped by each generation to fit their own struggles and hopes. In the modern era, Spartacus became a hero of revolutionary movements. Karl Marx called him one of his heroes, describing him as the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history. A communist revolutionary group in Germany during World War I called themselves the Spartacus League. Throughout the 20th century, his name was invoked by those fighting against tyranny and injustice. A Hollywood film in 1960 made him a symbol of the fight for human dignity and freedom. The gladiator who died on an Italian battlefield 2,000 years ago became an immortal symbol of the human spirit's refusal to accept bondage. What history does not always tell you about Spartacus is the full humanity of his story. He was not just a military leader or a symbol. He was a man who had experienced the worst that his world had to offer. He had been stripped of his freedom, his dignity, and his very humanity. He He was told that his life had no value except as entertainment for others, and yet he refused to accept that judgment. He fought back. He gave hope to tens of thousands of others who had also been told they were nothing. For a few brief years, he created something remarkable, an army of the enslaved that made the greatest power on earth tremble. The revolt of Spartacus failed in its immediate goals. The slaves did not escape over the Alps. They didn't establish a lasting free territory. Most of them died in battle or on crosses. But failure is not the same as meaninglessness. The very fact that we remember Spartacus, that we tell his story, that his name still has power, suggests that something important happened on those Italian fields. A man stood up and said no. He said that his life had value. He said that freedom was worth dying for. And 2,000 years later, we still remember. The historical sources for Spartacus are frustratingly incomplete. The ancient writers who recorded his story, men like Plutarch, Appian, and Florus, were all writing decades or centuries after the events. They were Romans or Roman sympathizers, and their accounts naturally reflected Roman biases and perspectives. They gave us the outline of the military campaign, the names of the Roman commanders, the locations of battles, but they could not or would not tell us what Spartacus himself thought or felt. They could not tell us about the debates in the rebel camp, the arguments over strategy, the hopes and fears of the slaves themselves. What we are left with is a silhouette, the shape of a man seen against the bright light of recorded history. We know what he did, but we can only guess at who he truly was. Was he primarily motivated by a desire for personal freedom? By hatred of Rome? By a genuine concern for his followers? By simple survival instinct? We do not know. The inner life of Spartacus is lost to us, probably forever, but perhaps that very mystery is part of what makes his story so powerful. Each generation can see in Spartacus what they need to see. He becomes a mirror for our own hopes and values. The world that Spartacus lived in was built on foundations that we today find abhorrent. Slavery was not a shameful secret of Roman society. It was a central institution, openly practiced and legally protected. Millions of human beings lived and died as property. They worked in mines, on farms, in households and in workshops. They were bought and sold, bred like livestock, and disposed of when no longer useful. The gladiatorial games that trained Spartacus were spectacles of organised murder, presented as entertainment for the masses. This was the normality of the ancient world. To understand Spartacus, we must understand this context without excusing it. The slaves who joined his rebellion were not simply fighting against bad treatment. They were fighting against a system that denied their very humanity. They were asserting, through the only means available to them, that they were people, not things. The violence they used was the violence of the desperate, of those who had been given no other way to be heard. It is not for us to judge too harshly from the comfort of our own times. We should instead marvel that in such a brutal world, the spark of resistance could still catch fire. The geography of the Spartacus revolt tells its own story. The rebellion began in Capua, in the fertile plains of Campania. It spread through the mountains and valleys of southern Italy. It ranged from the slopes of Vesuvius to the toe of the Italian boot and back up toward the Alps. This was a war of movement, of raids and marches, and desperate flights. The rebels knew the land in ways their Roman pursuers often did not. They used the terrain to their advantage, ambushing Roman columns in mountain passes and melting away into the countryside when outnumbered. The Italy of Spartacus's time was a land of stark contrasts. Great wealth existed alongside grinding poverty. The villas of the rich were worked by armies of slaves. The free peasant farmers who had once been the backbone of Roman society were being squeezed out, their land absorbed into the great estates. This social tension meant that the slave army sometimes found sympathy, or at least neutrality, among the poor free population. The lines between slave and free were not always as clear as the Roman elite would have liked. The military aspects of the rebellion reveal the genius of its leaders. Spartacus and his fellow commanders took untrained slaves and turned them into an effective fighting force. They imposed discipline on men who had every reason to simply scatter and flee. They developed strategies and tactics that repeatedly defeated Roman forces. This was not the work of mindless brutes or lucky amateurs. This was the work of intelligent, capable leaders who understood warfare and knew how to apply that understanding. The weapons and equipment of the gladiator schools gave the rebels their start, but they quickly adapted. They captured Roman equipment and learned to use it. They manufactured their own weapons when they could. They scavenged and improvised with remarkable ingenuity. An army that began with kitchen knives ended up equipped with legionary swords and armour. This adaptability was one of the keys to their early success. The divisions within the rebel army reflect the diversity of the enslaved population. The slaves came from all over the ancient world. Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Syrians, and many others found themselves united by their common bondage, but divided by their different languages, cultures, and goals. Keeping such a diverse group together was an enormous challenge. The split between Spartacus and Crixus showed how fragile that unity was. Perhaps no leader could have held such a varied coalition together indefinitely. The Roman response to the rebellion evolved over time. The early confidence gave way to fear, and then to a more measured determination. The Romans learned from their mistakes. They learned not to underestimate their enemy. They learned to use their superior resources and organisation effectively. In the end, it was the Roman system, the ability to raise army after army, to absorb defeat after defeat, and keep coming, that ground the rebellion down. Individual battles could be won through courage and skill, but the war required resources that the slaves simply did not have. The role of women and children in the rebellion is almost entirely unknown. Ancient sources barely mention them, but we know that slave families existed, that women and children must have been part of the movement. What happened to them after the final defeat? Some were presumably killed or recaptured. Some may have escaped and lived out their lives in hiding. Their stories are lost, another silence in the historical record. The aftermath of the rebellion saw changes in Roman attitudes towards slavery, though not fundamental ones. Slave owners became more cautious, more aware of the dangers of mistreatment. Some legal protections for slaves were strengthened, but slavery itself continued for centuries more. It would take the fall of the Roman Empire and the slow transformation of European society to eventually end the institution in the West, and even then, it would be reborn in new forms in other times and places. The cultural legacy of Spartacus is perhaps his most enduring monument. His name has been given to sports teams and political movements, to novels and films and television series. He has been claimed by revolutionaries and dreamers, by those who fight against injustice in all its forms. The gladiator from Thrace has become a universal symbol, transcending the specific circumstances of his life and death. When we look at what history does not always tell us about Spartacus, we find not gaps in the record, but invitations to reflection. We are invited to think about the nature of freedom and the cost of resistance. We are invited to consider what drives some people to risk everything rather than accept intolerable conditions. We are invited to ponder the relationship between power and justice, between the rules of society and the rights of individuals. The story of Spartacus reminds us that the past was not a simple place. It was full of complexity and contradiction, of cruelty and courage existing side by side. The Romans, who built one of history's greatest civilizations, also built that civilization on a foundation of human suffering. The slaves who rose up against their masters were capable of both heroism and atrocity. Nothing was simple, nothing was pure. This is the reality of human history, and Spartacus's story captures it in all its difficult truth. As we drift off to sleep, thinking about the gladiator who shook Rome, perhaps we can find in his story a kind of comfort. Not comfort in the violence or the tragedy, but comfort in the evidence it provides of human resilience. Spartacus faced impossible odds. He knew surely that he could not ultimately defeat Rome, and yet he fought anyway. He gave himself and his followers something that slavery tried to take away: agency, dignity, hope. For a brief time they were not property. They were people, fighting for what all people deserve. The mountains of Italy where Spartacus fought are still there. Vesuvius still looms over the Bay of Naples, though it has erupted many times since the gladiators made their camp in its crater. The Appian Way is still there too, though the crosses are long gone. Travellers still walk the ancient stones that once witnessed Rome's terrible revenge. The land remembers, even if the names are forgotten. In the end, what history does not tell us about Spartacus may be less important than what it does tell us. A man rose up, he fought, he lost. But in losing, he won something that his conquerors could never take away. He won a place in memory. He won the admiration of future generations who would see in his struggle the reflection of their own hopes for freedom. He won perhaps a kind of immortality. And so the story ends, but not really. The story of Spartacus is the story of everyone who has ever refused to accept that their life has no value. It is the story of everyone who has ever stood up against power and said this is wrong. It is a story that continues to be written, in struggles we read about in the news and in struggles that go unrecorded. The gladiator is gone, but what he represented lives on. The human spirit, when pushed to its limits, is capable of extraordinary things. That is the lesson of Spartacus. That is what history, in the end, does tell us.